You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 366 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer. I'll be your host, and I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's my cousin, and he's high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
It's going well, Jeremy, on this beautiful 51-degree evening.
It's been a while. It's been a while since we podcasted. October 14th was the last time we had a show. We said we weren't going to podcast unless there was news. There was something to talk about. And we were like, oh, Mike Talkman's gone, emergency podcast. Should we do what should we do it now? Should we do it now? And we waited and we waited. And we are here now, and we've got a full agenda because the Cubs did some things. They did the thing that
they got rid of Wisniewski. I mean, that was what we were waiting for.
It's unbelievable. We've got things to talk about. We will get into it in a moment. Before we do, the last time we podcasted, we had him on as a guest. First time we have news, we had to bring him back. Longtime friend of the show. You know him from all his writings at Northside Baseball, and you can find him at MA Trueblood on all of the social media platforms. Matt Trueblood, thanks for taking time out to talk Cubs with us tonight.
Yeah, I'm excited. I didn't quite realize I was going back to back here. Gotta live up to the billing now.
Well, it's because
we're doing our fall hibernation, our post-season hibernation. Now we're back in full force. Now that Cubs season is just around the corner.
The Cubs were horribly close to chasing me off this podcast if they were going to run back out the 2024 Cubs one more time in 2025. I don't know if I could have done that show again and again and again, but thank goodness we have some things to talk about. We'll start with the news of the offseason. We've had additions, we've had subtractions. Let's start with the big additions. Let's not bury the lead. Let's get right into the big Tucker trade, okay? Matt, let's start with your thoughts. Cubs got themselves a superstar, which they haven't had in years in this lineup.
Yeah, I was kicking this around with a couple of people. I think probably the best player overall that they've had since Chris Bryant was at his very best in 2016 and 2017. Almost pains me to say that as a stan of Javier Baez at his best too, but Tucker does it so much more conventionally, and convention is convention for a reason. He is a good fielder in right field, and he runs the bases really well when he's not playing on a broken shin bone like he was for the tail end of last year. But it's so much of it is just in the bat, and everything about the bat is good. There's not this but that you don't have to worry about. Yeah, he's going to strike out 26% of the time, but don't worry, he'll make up for it. No, he hits the ball hard in the air to the pull field over and over. He doesn't chase outside the zone, and he doesn't swing and miss very much. The last time the Cubs had that complete a hitter, I don't know, but we're going even farther back than Chris Bryant because he at least had holes in his swing.
Pat, how excited are you to see Tucker in right field this season?
Well, I'm very excited. Clearly, we've been talking about the Cubs' need for a player like this, lefty like this, somebody who can hit for power, somebody who can play defense, so really an all-around player. And I just happened to come across the Fangraphs like steamer predictions, like FWAR or one of those deals where they rank the top 100 players, regardless of position, pitcher, hitter, whatever, and they rank all the players based on projections for next year. And Kyle Tucker came in 18th. Now you may say, well, 18th, that's not very high. This is for pitchers and hitters, right? So just to give you a perspective on what that means, he was right behind Tariq Skubal, right, of the Tigers, Cy Young winner, I think, right? And just above Corey Seager, who was basically an MVP 2 years ago, and Ronald Acuna, who was the National League MVP 2 years ago, and Corbin Carroll and Vladimir Guerrero. They were all behind him, right? So that's how good he is, right? That's the That's what this team desperately needed. And to put that in perspective, the only other two Cubs who made the top 100 list, a little surprisingly, at 64th was Ian Happ, a bit higher than I thought. And then, in fact, he was ahead, and I know you're not going to like this, Matt. He was ahead of Jackson Churio by one. We'll see how that plays out.
Time. Yeah,
exactly. And then good old Dansby Swanson, the defensive genius at shortstop, was 86th. But the Cubs, for a long time now have had guys maybe as high as 64, certainly maybe somebody in the 80s, but not a top 20 guy, right? And that's what they desperately have needed. And Suzuki wasn't even on that list, in part I think because of his DH sort of I think functionality at this point. But the idea of having Tucker's bat with a Suzuki and with Ian Happ and some other people, you can start to see the beginnings of a lineup where you can string together 5 hitters in a row who you're like, oh, wouldn't I, where a pitcher would be like, I don't really want to face him, like as opposed to last year when the Cubs had 5 or 6 guys in the lineup any one time who were barely hitting 200. I mean, there were times when the bottom half of the lineup was just absolutely awful. And now you're starting to see it kind of lengthen. We talked about that. The hope was when the Cubs got Paredes last year that would kind of add to that element, but this puts it in a whole new direction. And you throw in a Michael Busch and, depending on what happens with third base and depending on what happens with Nico Horner and some others, you can really start to see the Cubs putting together a lineup where not only is it long and deeper, but you can start to kind of play. Remember with Sosa, we used to play this game all the time. It's like, well, Cubs are down 1 in the 7th, but if we get one man on, then Tucker will bat in the bottom of the 7th. So there is like that kind of thing. It's been a while since we've had that feeling, and certainly, as to Matt's point, when you had Rizzo, Bryant, and Baez kind of in their primes together, along with quite a few other like good complementary players like the Zobrists, et cetera, you had that feeling, right, where you had guys who you just had enough guys who you felt comfortable could be the guy in any game in any situation, and you have to, and this is starting to get us back into that mindset, which is great. And I give kudos to the Cubs for making the move. It's a move that, surprising in some respects for Jed, because you're taking a gamble with a guy who is in the last year of a contract who you may or may not re-sign, and you had to give up, in this case, your first-round draft pick from this last year, which is something the Cubs have been reluctant to do, give up a prospect. But I think it makes a lot of sense. And actually, when you look at what the Cubs gave up for him, I think that's a pretty reasonable package. And it does kind of give you a little more flexibility now. You lost your third baseman, but that's okay. I think on the last podcast in October, one of the frustrations that we shared mutually was that the Cubs didn't have any spots to fill in the lineup, but they desperately needed to improve the lineup, right? So it was this real difficult sort of catch-22 that they were in, and now they've improved the lineup, and they also have spots that they can fill in. So in that regard, I think they're headed in the right direction.
Yeah, Matt, this was something this podcast has been screaming about, that if you're not going to participate in free agency, you're not going to go after the superstars that are available, then you have to be creative. You have to go out and make trades. And you've built up, all we hear about is the farm system and how great it is and how you've got all these players, like you mentioned, Pat, with no place to play. You got to do something, whether it's trading a position player or it's trading prospects, or in this case, a combination of both, to get an actual legit superstar, someone in the lineup. I no longer do I ask the question, who is the Cubs' best player? And some people say Dansby Swanson, and some people would say Cody Bellinger, and I'd say, well, then your team sucks. Like, if that's your best player, they're no good. Now the answer is Tucker. Then I'm like, oh yeah, that guy who
had more WAR last year than Dansby Swanson, but he did it in like 76 games or something, which is impressive.
Yeah. I mean, it really, I think, to put almost too fine a point on it, but hopefully this helps clarify it for people. The list of hitters in this league who are clearly and enduringly better than Kyle Tucker right now is Aaron Judge, Mookie Betts, Shohei Ohtani, Juan Soto, and that's it. That's
good company.
Night and day from where they were. And it just is really, it's great to have a long lineup. It's great to have depth and balance and all of it, which the Cubs haven't achieved enough of over the last couple of years anyway. But you do want to have that depth and you want to have that balance. But when those things falter, if you have someone like Tucker at that level, at that threshold, you can make up for it in a way that you can't with Ian Happ or even a hot Seiya Suzuki. It's not quite the same. This has a chance to be that kind of transformational move. It is really interesting, right? That this winter they could have gone after one of the guys I just listed, Juan Soto. And last winter, they could have gone after one of the guys I just listed in Shohei Ohtani. And the winter before that, they could have gone after Aaron Judge. They didn't do any of those. And they didn't even trade for Soto last year when it would have been the same situation as Tucker is this year. They chose this moment and this player, which, you know, it says something about how Jed likes to build rosters. I also think it says something about the moment they're in. They tried it a different way. They ran into a bunch of walls, and maybe we feel like they should have figured this out sooner, but at least they did figure it out. And they said, this is the point, even though it's only 1 year that you get this guy for, you have to pay a pretty handsome price, but it's all in talent instead of money, really. And you're just going for it. You're not going for it all in. You're not completely selling the future, but you put in a bunch of chips to get the major upgrade for the very heart of your order. And you take care of the rest around that and just hope that it has a lasting impression on your franchise, even if Tucker does go get $450 million from someone else next winter.
There's a very realistic possibility that Kyle Tucker will outperform Julio Rodriguez, maybe Jose Ramirez, Fernando Tatis Jr. We're talking about guys who otherwise we think, just in a vacuum, as being these great players. And now the Cubs have somebody at that level who can, you know, can be thought of as comparable. And that's something that Cubs fans are going to have to get used to again. It's been a while.
It has. And if you're watching on our YouTube feed, you can see me raising a glass of G4 Reposado tequila to celebrate the Cubs adding a hitter like this to their lineup. They've also added some other players. We'll talk about them as well. Some other pieces that were added before we get to the pitching side of the discussion. So Carson Kelly was another player that we've talked about here on this podcast as someone we hope that this was another need the Cubs had to fill, and they went out and got this guy. Pat, what are your? We'll lead off with you. Your thoughts on some of the rest of the signings that the Cubs did on the hitting side.
Matt may think this is a little too pessimistic. I feel like Carson Kelly is the bare minimum the Cubs could have done this offseason in order to improve their catching situation in any kind of a quasi-credible way. And, you know, they got a guy who could platoon with Miguel Amaya, and depending on how things play out, they could patch together a situation better than last year's at catcher. It's not the kind of upgrade that we had hoped for. We had dreams of the Cal Raleighs of the world or other catchers who the Cubs might trade for. And those things did not materialize. Catchers apparently are of great value these days. But certainly going into next season, the catching combination of Kelly and Miguel Amaya should be better than certainly what the Cubs had last year with a sort of a fastly fading Yan Gomes and Miguel Amaya, who really struggled mightily until July or so. So, I mean, it's better than nothing. It's not the big. That was a position we had sort of circled on the diamond as being the one the Cubs could make the most hay on with an upgrade. They chose to upgrade elsewhere, which is fine. It doesn't really matter where you do it, but I can accept that. And getting Gage Workman, who's a decent enough third baseman, maybe he beats out Mastroboni and in camp, hopefully, just to end that experiment. But I think the Cubs still have work to do offensively. They still have some pieces they have to juggle. They have too many guys in the minors. They've got, and we'll get to the other outfield logjam here in a minute, but I think they're on the right track with the hitters. I think they still have some work to do. So it's sort of incomplete at this moment, but I can't complain really when you look at it in totality.
Matt, it's been a while since this podcast couldn't complain. Let's look at the players that have left us here and what that means for some of the kids.
Just like the Oscars when they show the pictures of the,
in memoriam.
In memorial, yeah.
And then we'll talk about some of the kids that will get an opportunity now to try to fill some of the holes left of the Rosario, Wisdom, Tauchman, Madrigal, Adbert Alzolay, Cam Smith, of course, and Isak Paredes and Hayden Wesneski, all gone. Obviously, you touched on Cam Smith being their top draft pick. Anyone else on that list are you disappointed to see on the way out?
I wouldn't say disappointed about any of them. Not disappointed about the decision to move on from any of them. Disappointed that it had to happen for several of them. I think this is a group that different people had different levels of faith ever in, like Nick Madrigal, for instance. Maybe you never really warmed to that idea. It was frustrating to watch him. I get that one. Patrick Wisdom, you knew it was time for them to say goodbye and just move on. And he's going to Korea, which is where he belongs at this phase of his career. But that one's a little melancholy because he was pretty good at something for a little while at a time when the team was full of guys who weren't good at really anything.
And they finally carved out at bats for him, and now he's gone. So,
well, we talked about that, I think, the last time I was on, is that they tried something this year where instead of stretching him beyond where his skills really fit, they tried to put him into a role that suited his skill set well, except it turns out that's always a risk because you're never sure whether a guy needs those regular reps to get to all of their talent. And he turns out to be that kind of player. So it just didn't fit anymore. I'm not sure that Mike Tauchman's a completely different story from that either. So it was the right time to move on from Tauchman. Does leave their outfield a little bit thin. It's going to get really interesting. They're going to trade Cody Bellinger. We'll get to that. But after that happens, who's the backup center fielder at this point? So getting rid of Tauchman, while I think it was the right choice, is an interesting choice. But none of them jump out as like this one might come back to bite him. It's just, in some cases, it's a real bummer. I don't think anybody wanted to have to say goodbye to Brennan Davis or Adbert Alzolay, but those were careers that long ago were derailed by injury. Alzolay pulled his back onto the rails briefly, but now that he's going to be out all of next season anyway, you just couldn't justify carrying him all winter, taking up a 40-man spot.
Oh, they've struggled with their 40-man maintenance.
No production.
Yeah, just those 40-man spots are at a premium for this team. Just couldn't do it. So where does Matt Shaw fit into this for you, Matt, for the 2025 Cubs? Where is he playing?
And I'd just like to give a caution to the listeners that, unlike everyone else in Cubs Twitter, Matt is a little more skeptical of Matt Shaw's
thanks for the disclaimer
and floor due to his high leg kick on his swing. But leaving that aside,
I am, and yet I think at this point I'd be kind of surprised if he's not the opening day third baseman. That's not to say that he'll be the every single day third baseman. I do think there's still a chance the Cubs bring in Yoan Moncada, Josh Rojas, any of a few.
Moncada just broke his foot or something in Winter League today. He's out for the
winter. Yeah, but hopefully he's good to go at least by the spring. there are a few guys out there who can play a good, solid third base. They're not going to hit a lot, but they're cromulent, at least as like a platoon or a timeshare kind of thing. I could see the Cubs signing any of them and sort of pairing them up with Shaw. I don't think they drafted Gage Workman with the idea that he's going to be a starter, because he's never played above Double-A, and he was a Rule 5 draft pick out of the Tigers system, who at Double-A last year struck out 28% of the time. They're not envisioning giving that guy a starting job of any kind. So even if he makes the roster, he's a backup. The idea is clearly someone else is going to fill that role, and I think that they're just sort of mentally handing that to Shaw. And he's a good enough athlete. I think he can play the position perfectly well. Yes, I am on record, and I'll stick to it. I think he's going to have some tough adjustments to make hitting big league pitching. But the pressure on him is much less, too, than if you were handing him the same job after trading away Nico Horner for more pitching instead of trading away Isaac Paredes for Kyle Tucker. Now if you call up Shaw and make him your everyday third baseman, he's probably batting 7th most days, and you can live with that. And in a year or two, you hope that you feel really good about batting him 1st or 5th or something. But in the meantime, he's a solid contributor, which is ultimately, I think this is the part that people need to keep their eyes on, is he's the top prospect in a system that we all know is pretty strong. And the inclination is to start inflating in your head and going, if the Cubs have a good farm system and Matt Shaw is the best prospect in it, Matt Shaw must be a star in the making. It's not really like that. He was the 13th overall pick out of college. He's like 5'9". He has a pretty low ceiling, but what he also has is a very high floor. So I don't think it's a bad thing in the context of the lineup they've created by managing to hold on to Seiya and trade for Kyle Tucker to slot Shaw in next year on a pretty regular basis. It's just he's going to be more like that average player as opposed to big-time contributor. And fortunately, you no longer have to ask him to be a big-time contributor. He's a good, solid role player who doesn't give back any of the value you hope you're getting from the top of your lineup.
For the record, Jeremy, I'm hoping that we see more out of Matt Shaw than we did out of Mike Olt and Donnie Murphy. But, time will tell.
Let's switch gears to the pitching side, where since we last podcasted, Matthew Boyd was signed by the Cubs as Kyle Hendricks is gone. Matthew Boyd comes in towards the back of the rotation. Still, Cubs are missing that top of the rotation starting pitcher that we hoped that they would be looking for. We'll get to the qualifying offer situation and going over the luxury tax in a moment. But on the pitching side of things, Pat, we'll start with you. With Matthew Boyd can't be it, can it?
I don't think so. I hope not. I've always actually liked Boyd. I certainly did years ago when he was younger, and he's had some injuries over time, but in flashes he's been quite good, and it feels like the Cubs are kind of playing for guys who they think have upside but have injury risks as well, which is, it's one way to gamble, because the alternative to that is to pay a guy $182 million over 5 years, right? I mean, there isn't a whole lot of in between on those types of things. So I'm perfectly happy with getting Boyd. I think it's a tricky situation for the Cubs in terms of their starting staff, because apart from Steele and Imanaga and Taillon, they have a guy like Assad who is sort of nebulous. Is he a starter as a reliever? Now you throw Boyd into the mix, and then on top of that, they've got a plethora of young pitchers, all of whom were hurt last year, all of whom ended up the season hurt. And really, I mean, Wicks came back at the very end, but we don't really know what they have. I mean, I don't know if Cade Horton's going to pitch this year. I don't know if Ben Brown's going to pitch this year. I don't know what Jordan Wicks is going to. And that's a lot of question marks from the young guys who I think, had counted on by now to be filling some of these voids. So the Matthew Boyds of the world, although the price seemed, when you first saw it from a sticker shock standpoint, kind of expensive, you see some of the prices for other pitchers going on, and you're like, well, I guess it's not that expensive. So I can see what they're doing and trying to fill some holes, but it does feel like they still need one more guy if they want to be real serious, credible contenders. Because yes, he has an injury history, but you know what? Anyone in the Cubs rotation could get hurt, and more or less has, except for Managa last year. And so you just need a lot of arms, and you need a lot of arms who hopefully, when they're healthy, will pitch well. So if that's the plan, then go out and get at least one more and see what you can do.
Matt, who do you hope that the Cubs are targeting this for the pitching?
Yeah, well, so yeah, just to be clear about it, I think it's fairly well accepted at this point that they are going to add someone else. It's probably going to be via trade, not free agency. And I think the names have started to be whittled down. The one I probably like the most out of the realistically available options is Luis Castillo. I've always liked Luis Castillo, and I probably always will. But they seem to be leaning a lot harder toward Jesus Luzardo of the Marlins, because apparently they want nothing but lefties. It's their number one goal. Number two goal is winning a World Series. Number one goal is not to have a right-handed pitcher throw a pitch all year.
As a lefty who used to pitch, I don't blame them for that.
Yeah.
But I'm with Matt 100%. And if you go back to our last podcast with Matt on October 14th, I floated the idea of a Luis Castillo trade, because primarily and precisely because he is making a lot of money. There are two ways you can go about this. You can go to a team and say, hey, you've got a pitcher who's making a lot of money for the next couple of years, and you may want to shed that contract. We'll give you some value for it, but a lot of the value you'll receive will be in payroll flexibility. And then, to Matt's other point, the other option, and the one they seem to be leaning towards, is, hey, you've got a guy who's on a really cheap deal for the next couple of years, who's under team control. We'll give you prospects, but it'll be a higher price because he is cheap. The pitcher we're getting back is going to be cheap, and maybe not quite as established or quite as good as the guy making the more money. So two different approaches you can take here. It seems like the Cubs are more focused on the Marlins idea of going this way, and I don't know. I mean, hard to say which is better, but Luzardo, I guess, is the. And you've seen the rumors for Dylan Cease. That seems a little fanciful to me, because he's a pretty good pitcher who makes money, and I just don't understand why he would be available for the Cubs and at what price that would be the case. And I don't know, Matt, if you have thoughts on that.
I can shed some light on that. So first of all, Cease, like Michael King, the Padres' other co-ace at this point, they're both free agents after this year, in theory. I think the Padres' thought is to extend King. Huh?
They're going to choose one, and they're going to choose King?
They'll extend King because he's had a very different career arc that has sort of pinned down his earnings in arbitration. They've probably got a lot better leverage to work out an extension with him. Cease is also going to earn over $15 million, I think, in arbitration this year, which they've got payroll issues they've got to sort out because they need to replace some outgoing players. They need a catcher. They need a left fielder. They need another starter anyway. So they'd like to trade the more expensive option. I think Cease is definitely available in trade. And the Cubs have the pieces to make pretty much any trade they want to work, especially after getting Tucker without giving up any of their top, let's say, 5 prospects. But I agree that Cease is probably unlikely for that very same reason, which is just one more year of control. How hard do you really want? You'd have to give up a couple more premium long-term pieces to get Cease. And now Cease and Tucker both hit free agency at the end of next year. boy, you better have made a lot of hay while that sun was shining because you thinned out that farm system in a hurry.
Yeah, you have to sign Bregman basically to play third base or make these really substantial moves to be serious enough to do that, I think.
Exactly. And I don't think they're interested in doing that. So I think it kind of comes down to what more long-term controllable, maybe not long-term. Luzardo's only two more years, but at least moderately controllable guys can they target. And I also think they're looking for ways, we can quibble with this process and say, God, Tom, just spend more money. But the way they're actually going about it, instead of just looking to acquire player value, like talented players that not much has to be done for, those guys are expensive. But if you go out and target someone like Luzardo, who's had some injury issues over the years, but also had shown a ton of promise, and who you feel like there's still some stuff to unlock because the Marlins just aren't that good at pitching development, or haven't been. They just hired Daniel Moskos from the Cubs, so they might be about to get that way. But so far, they haven't been. I think they're trying to create value. Is where can we target a guy that we can bring in and then improve? That's what the Brewers have been kicking their butts at for a long time, where, they could target William Contreras much more realistically because they knew we're going to bring in this guy that everyone thinks almost has to be moved off of catcher. We're going to make him a plus defensive catcher. If you have those kinds of tools, you got to put some faith in them and say, we really do think we can get the most out of Luzardo in a way the Marlins haven't. But if you do believe you can do that, it's probably worth pursuing that as opposed to paying $25 million a year for the next 3 years to Luis Castillo, even though I really love Luis Castillo. It also puts a little extra faith, I think, by targeting Luzardo or anyone at Luzardo's tier instead of that higher tier up. Maybe they're telling us that they really do believe in Imanaga and in Steele as good enough to front a playoff caliber rotation. I'm sure they're not mistaking them for Blake Snell, Zach Wheeler, the very, very best pitchers in the league. But whereas I might slot those guys into the top 20, the top 40, but not the top 20 in all of baseball in terms of starting pitchers, they're probably thinking they're somewhere in that 10 to 20 range. And if that's true, then yeah, you can afford to roll the dice with someone like Luzardo, who, if you get the development right, and if he stays healthy, will climb right up into that tier with Steele and Imanaga, as opposed to shopping in an expensive aisle for the guy who is already better than those two.
The Cubs need Luzardo and Boyd to be relatively healthy this year. Yeah, and on the Cubs team.
I was going to say we're already just counting.
But they also need, in an ideal world, Cade Horton to somehow become healthy, or for Ben Brown to be fixed, or for Jordan Wicks to come out this year and prove to be like, an everyday, no sweat, high end fifth starter or something. They need, in an ideal world, somebody else to step up, because Jameson Taillon and it has his ups and downs, and they bet heavy on him by not trading him at the deadline last year, right? They're keeping him for this next 2 years. Better work. Imanaga didn't miss any time last year. Well, everybody gets hurt, it seems like, right? And then you've got the Steele situation where he's going to need an extension at some point, and he did get hurt last year, early in the season. And so, like with any staff, you have to basically have 8 guys who you can say, okay, well, these are my 8 starters. And over the course of a season, we'll rely on 5 of those 8 at all times. And right now the Cubs aren't quite there. So, Luzardo would be another piece in that. I still like the Luis Castillo. I think that'd be great to get him back to the NL Central.
Heck of a lot more durable too. If we are talking about
right?
That part, just night and day difference that way. So
he'd be like a Taillon who's good, in the sense that he, you just send him out there and he's kind of a workhorse.
Yeah.
The question is, can the Cubs add pitching without moving a Cody Bellinger, or do you have to move Cody Bellinger if you're the Cubs? Do you have to trade him? Do you feel like you have to? You don't have to do anything because you are the Cubs. You can do anything you want. we feel that they are going to trade Cody Bellinger, and what is that? Matt, would you prefer a lineup that has Cody Bellinger in it with this Cubs team as it is, or one that they've moved on from Cody Bellinger?
With the personnel that they now have, I don't see a need or place for Cody Bellinger, which is not necessarily a knock on Cody Bellinger. I think he's an okay player. It's just I don't want him in center field. He can't play center field for my team, which is a shame because I think PCA is one of the people I still have, significant questions about. Not that I'm saying he'll never be good, but I think there's more risk there than maybe even the Cubs are accounting for. But since I don't think that he's a credible center fielder at this point, he's not as good as Kyle Tucker. He's not as good as Ian Happ. He's not as good as Seiya Suzuki. And he's really not as good as Michael Busch. I am also not a believer that you can move Michael Busch to second or third base. He's a very good first baseman, and that is all he is. And that's okay. Not every player is everything that you could possibly dream they'd be. I think Busch is never going to be good enough at any defensive position other than first base, but he's a better hitter right now than Cody Bellinger is, and a very, very good defender, just like Cody Bellinger is at first base. Plus, so that's like taking the money out of the equation here, which I know we're loath to do because it feels like letting the Ricketts off the hook. But I will say, taking the money out of the equation, I would still want and expect them to trade Cody Bellinger. And going from what I want or expect or anything to just what I've heard and what I kind of feel like I know, since we started this podcast, I have been checking my phone once or twice because I feel like we're that close. I feel like by the time this is posted, Cody Bellinger could be traded. I think
we do that. We do that with this podcast.
if he is a Cub on Christmas, I will be shocked. Just knock me over with a feather. I think he's as good as gone. And while I wish the team was willing to spend a lot more money, even if they had a lot more money to spend, I'm not sure it would need to be on Cody Bellinger at this point. So
I agree that I think the Cubs will trade Bellinger. But to your point about if money were not an object, like if the Cubs are willing to go, like, say, $100,000 over the luxury tax, again, which they apparently did last year. They could have just cut Mike Tauchman in August and they would have been under the luxury tax. But that's neither here nor there. If the Cubs were willing to, if money were not that big of an issue for them, I actually think, and this is sort of a counter position to what you were saying, Matt, I actually think he'd be a great fail-safe for the Cubs because I really think that I have concerns with PCA in playing every day in center field. And I think Bellinger, although not a center fielder who you really want to bank on, I think he could play center field 30 games a year, right? Maybe just enough to give PCA rests against certain matchups with pitchers and not have to play every day in the grind and hopefully help even him out there. Same thing with Busch. When you've got these lefty-righty matchups, there's a lot you could do. You could play Bellinger in right field sometimes or left field, or you could DH him, or you could play him at first. And all the guys that we talk about, they all go on the IL. I mean, Seiya Suzuki's going to go on the IL for a month. I don't know which month, but it'll be some month, right? And if it's not a month, it'll be 2 or 3 weeks. And Ian might miss a couple weeks or 10 days with something, and Bellinger himself will miss time, right? I mean, that's just been the experience I've seen with this Cubs team. I just think that you could probably squeeze out, 120 games for Bellinger, which for him is considered a full season, by the way. I know it's not the best use of money per se, like for $27 million or whatever it is, but it certainly would cover a lot of potential problems, right? When Busch, like last year, he went in a terrible slump when they were just pitching those high fastballs to him. It'd be nice to bring Bellinger in against certain right-handed pitchers and say, okay, well, we're going to have Cody bat in this game or play first base this game. He's a good defensive first baseman too, so that's actually a plus right there. And I just think there are ways that they could utilize these guys since they really have. We're talking about 4 positions 5 positions, 3 outfield positions, first and DH. And honestly, with Bellinger, they have 6 guys for 5 positions, which isn't the worst thing in the world, frankly. So I know that won't happen, but I could see in an alternate universe where while it's not sort of normal anymore, it used to be the norm, like back in the 80s. Look at the 84 Cubs. They had guys like that all over the place.
Yeah.
I just like that flexibility.
I think it doesn't have to be, or it shouldn't have to be efficient, right? The Cubs should be comfortable not spending every dime maximally efficiently. If Cody was just a really good guy you could float around, and yeah, he's a little stretched when you play him in center, but keeps
Different
everyone
ballparks, small parks. You could figure out the places too. You're not doing it in cores, but you're doing it.
I think a lot of it comes down to personality and some ego management too. Now, you can make a case. I'm sure somebody somewhere has already made the case. That's what the $40 million's for, Craig Counsell. Smooth this over. But he's already going to spend a chunk of the season smoothing over and sort of rotating in, say, a Suzuki, who we found out at the winter meetings doesn't really like being a full-time DH. And that's suddenly his role on this team.
Does he like catching fly balls that are hit directly at him? Because, there are different ways you can do this.
They didn't ask, say, his agent if he liked that. They only but I think you've got enough issues kind of there.
Yeah. You don't. But the egos are big these days, right? Yeah. I won't deny that. And, maybe Cody's ego would be a little smaller because not only did he correctly, by the way, as we pointed out in the last podcast, not opt out, because that would have been foolish, because the market was a lot softer than the majority of Cubs Twitter had predicted it would be when they were talking about how he's the top center fielder on the market and would get a 5-year deal making $100-some million. And we were sitting there scratching our heads thinking, no, that's probably not going to happen. He should just stay, right? Now it turns out the market for him is so soft that no one wants him unless the Cubs pay part of his salary, right? Like that's a real, talk about coming full circle. You could get to the point where you start looking at this and say, boy, what we once thought a year ago in March or whatever, in February, was a great move by Hoyer to scoop him up at the end. What a shrewd move to get him on this 3-year, with the opt-out contract, short-term deal. How shrewd of Jed. Now it just looks like an albatross. It's crazy how that happened so fast. Or if not an albatross, sort of a mini albatross, right?
Yeah.
That's
another complicating factor, though, right? Is that Cody, if normally he'd be inclined to, okay, I'll ride the bench occasionally, all for the good of the team. He
doesn't want to. He wants to go somewhere next year too, right?
Exactly.
That's the problem.
He does not. He wants to be able to earn the right to maybe opt out or not. He wants to at least explore his options, and you can't do that from sort of the 10th or 11th regular spot. So
it will be interesting to see what the Cubs do in terms of trade with him. I saw Meathead Central in New York. Some guy in Staten Island at a bar stool probably complaining about how, you know what we should do? We should trade. We should get that Nico Horner and Bellinger, and the Cubs will pay us like $7 million, and we'll throw in Marcus Stroman, because they need a pitcher. Yeah, that's not happening ever. Yeah. So, but the question does become, and the names being is it Adam Warren? Is he? I thought the Cubs already got him from the Yankees. What's going on here? That was like in 2016. Wasn't that part of the Castro trade? What am I missing?
Gonna give me flashbacks.
I know, and that guy ended up sucking, and that was too bad because we had hopes for him. But anyway, at least with the Cubs, he did. Then he went back to the Yankees, and he was fine.
He was good again.
Yeah,
go figure.
But I've heard rumors of something like that. But the Cubs still having to pay a significant portion of the salary back, which really does speak to maybe the wisdom of the deal in the first place.
Yeah, and I think it's people keep throwing out this $32.5 million number for him for this year, which that would be a little onerous if it was true. It's kind of really not. The way the contract is structured, it's 3 years and $80 million, and it basically goes 30, 30, 20. It's just the money is moved around by buyouts should he take the opt-out, and then a mutual option for a 4th year. So it's not so much that he is owed so much money this year that the contract's underwater for the 1 year. The money you'd be sending along is sort of like a a cushion for the team to say,
in case you're stuck with him next year.
Right. He may opt in for 2026. And just in case that happens, we'll have softened the blow for you, especially because you're going to be trading him to, let's be real here. They're talking about the Giants. They're still trying to drum up some rumors with Seattle, or I don't know. They're trading him to the Yankees. Yeah. They agreed to trade him to the Yankees before they finished the Tucker deal on Friday. And the only thing separating them then was money. And that's still all that's separating them. They have basically a player's deal in place, and it's just about how much money is going to get paid down. I'm still like 95% sure it's just going to get sorted out. So you're trading him to the Yankees. The Yankees are way over 2 or 3 tiers of the luxury tax. They want to quiet down that annual average value for the contract. So
they're off to a good start this offseason with getting rid of Soto.
Well, yeah. But then they've been, frantically stacking money back onto their roster ever since.
Right.
So every bit that you can send them helps them with their tax bill, helps them, it's almost like send them 2 million, save them 4.
Yeah, it's a 2-for-1 really at this point.
The stakes there are nominally important, not actually important because no one needs that much money and they've got way, way, way more than that anyway. But that's why we're sort of at this standstill. I still think he just ends up getting dealt to the Yankees, but that money that they do need to pay or are perceived as needing to pay to get any kind of substantial return, it's mostly about the fact that you might have him for 2026 too. So we better have something to kind of offset the overall value of the contract from here.
Speaking of contracts, Pat, you mentioned the Cubs going over the luxury tax last year. As we talked about on the podcast last season, we knew it was under $500,000. We knew that. Now it's looking more like just a couple $100,000 over.
Maybe 100,000.
Maybe
either
even
1 or 2.
Yes, it's an obscenely low amount of money, which we've said if you're going to go over the luxury tax, go way over. There's no reason to barely go over. That's malpractice of handling the thing that is near and dear to Tom Ricketts' heart, and that is the luxury tax. And it was mishandled by this Cubs front office. No, nothing. You like you mentioned, you could have cut somebody. You could have made that work if you knew. Cubs misplayed that, which Megan Montemurro was talking to Carter Hawkins, GM of the Cubs, and asked him about pursuing a player who has a qualifying offer when discussing people like Corbin Burns. And he said, quote, "Hypothetically, I wouldn't rule it out, but at this point, I don't see us being active that way because going over the luxury tax threshold in 24, if they sign a player who has a qualifying offer, they'd lose $1 million in international bonus pool money for the upcoming signing period, plus a 2nd and 5th highest draft picks in 2025. So when we look at who the Cubs are going to be targeting, Carter made it pretty clear that that is a costly mistake. Going over the
I feel like if you act incompetently, you shouldn't punish the fans for your mistake.
Yeah. I will say, I think it's almost like cover. I don't think they ever intended to spend on any of the players who received qualifying offers this particular winter. It does still shock me. It's foolish malpractice that they ended up in this place. It was such a small margin that I actually asked around to some of the people who maintain public resources on this kind of salary info and asked, are we within a margin of error here? It looked for a little bit like it would be $2.5 million.
Yeah.
If Cody had opted out, it was clearly like $2.5-3 million they were over it. And that made sense. Whatever. You made a choice, like Jed said in September or whatever, when he was on the score. that he chose to go over the CBT by signing Bellinger. But once Bellinger opted out, the margin, or opted back in rather, because that changes the AAV of his deal, the margins get so razor thin that I was like, surely they foresaw this and factored it in a bit, and they'll come in slightly under. And we're just seeing a margin of error here. That it actually turns out they were within that margin of error and over the line. It's a really bad look. I don't think it makes a huge difference. Like, we talk about the penalties you pay if you do sign a QO guy. If you're not, if you are a revenue tax or a revenue sharing payer like the Cubs, who pays revenue sharing anyway because you're one of the big markets, and you're not over the tax, then you still give up your second pick and $500,000 in international bonus money. So what's the difference of going over it? It's an extra $500,000 in money to spend on Latin teenagers, and it's your fifth highest pick in the next draft. That's not a very big deal. It wouldn't stop them if they really thought, if Corbin Burns came to them tomorrow and said, I will sign that Cody Bellinger deal from last winter, 3 years and $80 million. They do it like that.
Yeah. Why doesn't he do that? That'd be good.
But I think really they were never going to be involved on any of those guys this winter. It's
really not Max Fried, who we thought was like the next tier down, but who signed for a significant amount of money.
That one got out of hand. And starting pitching markets, it's like the fourth or fifth year in a row that they've been getting out of hand. So at this point, we just have to accept that that's the market for starting pitching, which is why the Cubs are out trying to acquire guys that they can make better instead of acquiring guys who are already aces, right? But as much as the actual impacts of going over the tax are not very great, especially since it's pretty clear they're not going to go over the tax this year, it still just looks really bad on the front office. It seems like a stupid mistake.
Speaking of contracts that got out of hand, Juan Soto. We knew the Cubs were not going to be in on it, but holy cow, this deal, 15 years, $750 million. This deal, Matt, as soon as I saw this, after the Ohtani deal, it's Ohtani, it's a unicorn. You pay whatever.
And you don't have to pay it until a century from now. So
And when I saw that they did a lot of deferred money and they started to get weird, I'm like, oh, okay, like this could get crazy. And Juan Soto and the Mets, thank goodness for the Mets going crazy. I don't care. We talked about it before we started recording. Like, I will never care about other people spending their money. Good on you. Happy for Juan Soto. Happy for the Mets fans who have 2 stars at least, and with Lindor and Soto on that team. Great. We were just excited to have one now finally. So good for them. What my concern is these 2 contracts. I worry about the long-term ramifications for this, Matt, as we barrel towards a 2026 renegotiation of the collective bargaining agreement. I've seen this in hockey before, where the CBA had to be renegotiated to protect owners and GMs from themselves because the smaller market teams wanted to protect. they need help protecting themselves from themselves, and I worry that these deals could make for a longer negotiation and new things that could potentially lead to, if not a work stoppage, a significant delay in negotiations around a CBA.
Well, Jeremy, you identified a couple things that are sort of hockey relevant, but having to do with deferred money and length of contracts, et cetera.
That's how hockey got to where it got to with its work stoppage, was trying to put an end to creative contracts and capping them at a certain number of years and capping them at making it an average value instead of deferring money and being able to do this around a hard salary cap. And so it's, I don't know if it's PTSD from all the work stoppages in hockey, but this makes me nervous about 2026 because that CBA is coming due. I don't know your thoughts, Matt, on the ramifications of the Juan Soto contract.
Yeah, no, I don't think that this contract will age well. And I don't mean the player and his relative value. I mean, I think in 5 years, we're going to look back and go, what a misunderstanding of where the sport really was financially and historically this contract represented. And maybe that oversells it just because I don't think Steve Cohen is thinking anything about where the sport is financially or what its future is. I think Steve Cohen is thinking, I have this money and there's no realistic scenario in which I'll ever miss it. Go ahead.
He's the best player. He's the best player available.
Exactly. So, I mean, in that respect, good for Steve Cohen. But I do think MLB's up against some things that I'm not sure they're aware they're up against. You talk about things that might make the CBA negotiations more complicated. Well, you guys remember what it really came down to, what caused the 94 strike indirectly and then, or directly and then indirectly in a way. But it was not just players and owners collide. They collide over and over. They can't find common ground. They can't get together. The problem always is when it really comes rubber to the road in baseball, is when there are really three parties in the negotiation: players, small market owners, and big market owners.
Yep.
And we are hurtling toward that again because inequality in this game is growing massively. And it's not just a matter of, the TV contracts are one thing. Right now,
becoming a more serious thing too as time goes on with some of them collapsing completely.
Sure. A lot of the small markets have already gone over the cliff monetarily. I mean, there is a reason the Twins slashed payroll by $30 million last year. The Brewers, the Guardians, the Cardinals are working through it. It's not hitting them in quite as profound a way because there's still a bigger market for their product as they pivot toward streaming stuff. But anyone except the Dodgers, Cubs, Yankees, Mets, Red Sox,
Phillies.
Yeah. Those are the only teams essentially immune, maybe the Blue Jays too, from
Orioles maybe.
Crash.
And
here's the thing. These teams are immune from the broadcasting crash so far because what has happened so far is the RSN bubble has popped, and these teams who were affiliated with a network of regional sports networks across the country have just seen that company go bankrupt.
Well, in Chicago, we saw that with the White Sox, basically.
Sure.
The White Sox, Bulls, and Blackhawks are now in some sort of Netherland, fourth dimension, where you can only watch them on YouTube, and you have to pay like $20 a month per team. Like
you can't watch them on YouTube. You can't watch them on Comcast. You can only watch them if your antenna is pointed in the right direction on a non-windy, rainy day.
Yeah,
right. But the real thing is, all these teams, except for the handful of richest ones who own their own networks, have already gone over the cliff. What I think some of these rich teams, think that they will simply never have to go over the cliff. But they're gonna relatively soon because Marquee, everyone who's dealt with Marquee Network already knows this. Just because the Cubs own Marquee and can get the revenue directly that way doesn't mean that they're having any easier a time getting carried on standard cable packages by Xfinity or DirecTV or any of them.
You're underestimating the draw of one Ryan Dempster as a comedic force of nature.
Yeah, I almost did my Ryan Dempster doing Will Ferrell doing Harry Carey for a minute, but you can only do so many things. I think this sport has a big looming crisis that they think they're halfway done resolving it. They're 10% of the way done resolving it, or just living through it. And so there's this widening gap between haves and have-nots. There are owners like Cohen and like the Guggenheim Group for the Dodgers who could run an operating loss and just not miss it for several years. And so between their much higher revenues and their much greater actual wealth, it's such an unfair playing field because it literally hurt Steve Cohen less to hand out that contract to Juan Soto than it probably hurt the Brewers to give $80 million to Jackson Churio last winter. That's the scale we're at, and that's not tenable. It will not last very long. Now we're at 3 or 4 cycles of CBAs in a row where all the owners have gone, hey, we're all billionaires. What do we care if one of us has 15 billion and one of us has 2 billion? We're all billionaires. Let's just make sure everything stays good for us. But that cracks eventually. It just does not. I don't think that can hold. Even if it does hold, it's bad news for us as fans because the billionaires are just going to keep billionairing all over us. But I think eventually squabbles are going to break out in the ranks, and you're going to have, well, we already know Jerry Reinsdorf would really love to enforce a salary cap in this next round of CBA negotiations. And I think he's going to butt heads with Steve Cohen pretty darn hard. Steve Cohen, whom he tried to rally owners to keep out of owning the Mets in the first place. And I think the reason we are going to have a work stoppage 2 years from now is not just players and owners, but it's all the owners against the 4 or 5 richest ones. It won't even be the Cubs because they aren't even actually.
They'll side with the smart
bank. Because honestly, bank people. They're closer to being them than they are. The difference between the Cubs and the Guardians is not much larger than the difference between the Cubs and the Dodgers or the Cubs and the Yankees at this point.
Yeah, the Cubs are in a unique position, I think, versus the true small market teams. Like, say, even within the Midwest, like the Twins and the Brewers and teams like that. Yeah. Cubs do have their own television network. Whether or not it's profitable or not is another question. The Cubs really eke out a lot of money on really expensive tickets. Like, you could go to 5 Brewer games for the price of 1 Cubs game.
Yeah,
I've done it. Trust me. They charge the most for their beers and for their food and concessions. They have a very robust marketing and paraphernalia, clothing, market. They still are living off of the old days of the WGN Cubs, so they've got a fan base that's broader and wider than a lot of places, which they have utilized. They have turned that ballpark into a cash machine when it comes to the holidays and hockey games and football games and rock concerts and everything else. They're getting the absolute most they can get out of that team and out of that enterprise. And I don't know where they go from there. Like, I don't know how much more they can do to maximize money out of there. I feel like even with the ticket prices, like at some point they're running up against a ceiling where people are like, season tickets are not. There used to be a waiting list 20,000 people long. There's no waiting list for season tickets because people realize it's fool's gold to buy season tickets when you can go on StubHub and get seats for cheaper than face for a lot of games, except for the weekends in the summer. And the Cubs, I think, have almost outpriced themselves a little bit in an effort to squeeze out more money. Maybe the marquee thing hasn't gone as well as they'd hoped, and that's been sort of one of the negatives for them. But they're just in this kind of like middle ground between the real small markets that couldn't charge more for tickets if they tried, or charge a lot, and the teams like the Dodgers who got their TV contracts a couple of years before the Cubs did, the Phillies and the Yes Network in New York's been around forever, and so the Cubs kind of were late to the game on that, which hurt them. But there's just not. You look around and it's like, okay, come up with ways to make more money, and they do their best at marketing. They'll give them credit for that. They're really good at it, but they're sort of at their limit right now. And so if the Cubs feel that they can't spend more money on players because for whatever reason, whatever their profit margin they need to make in order to be happy with the with what they have is if they're at that point, that doesn't bode well at all, does it? Right? Because they're basically just at that top, that first payroll, luxury tax threshold, not the second, not the third, just kind of right around bumping heads on the first one. But they've got the eighth or ninth highest payroll in baseball, and if they don't feel, or if they're not willing to go higher than that, given all the income revenue sources that they have, I don't see how the teams below them could come anywhere near the, as things move forward. It's just, something's got to give. I think you're right. It's just not tenable.
Well, which is why Rob Manfred is pushing for nationalizing the whole broadcast, plan and coming up with I think where they may end up settling, because look, the players are not going to say yes to a salary cap. If for no other reason than where are the Ricketts getting a ton of their money right now? It's all the real estate they bought up around Wrigley that is just ching, ching, ching. Do you think the Ricketts are willing to count that as baseball associated revenue? No. So a salary
separate
cap,
LLC, Matt, it doesn't count.
Yeah. And for that reason, because the Ricketts are far from the only team doing that, or the only owners doing that, the players are not going anywhere near a salary cap. What I think the next step is small market teams are going to say, look, there is plenty of money in this pot. If you will at least, if they'll turn to the Ricketts and to the Liberty Media Group that owns the Braves and like everything around Truist Park, and they'll say, look, we don't have to admit to the players that this is all baseball revenue, but it's all baseball revenue. Now put it in a pot and we're going to share a lot more of our revenues than we ever have before. That's how you get to an equitable and sustainable system where this league can, first of all, you need a league where teams actually can compete on a relatively even footing.
8 teams on opening day will be mathematically virtually eliminated based on lack of talent.
Yeah. And over time, the way things are going, it's going to consistently be the same 8 teams, which is when you're really in trouble.
Right. It is.
But you need that competitive balance, that they talk about all the time. You also need eventually to be able to expand this league. And the only way, you're going to be expanding into relatively small markets that need to be brought along. And the only way it works is
Sacramento,
much more revenue sharing.
No, but Nashville and yes. In Charlotte and places like that, right?
So I think that's where it lands, is a lot more revenue sharing among the teams, but it's gonna take a lot of brawling before we land on that solution. So I think things are gonna get kind of ugly.
Well, let's end this podcast with a little trivia. Pat, I know you've got a trivia question for us. Let's do a little trivia, and then we'll wrap it up and call it a podcast.
Well, Jeremy, I did this with you yesterday in person when we were together. I will shorten it. I'll abbreviate it even more. So, Matt, I'm going to ask you for the names of 3 Major League Baseball players. These players are players who were born in the state of Illinois. The 3 players with the highest WAR, born in the state of Illinois, who played Major League Baseball during your lifetime. You've either seen them in person or you've seen them on television, but these are definitely people you have watched. These are not people from the 1960s or 50s or 40s. These are modern players.
Sure.
90s and beyond. They've played in the decade of the 90s and beyond.
Okay. Kenny Lofton.
He was not born in Illinois, although he's from Chicago, oddly enough. I guess he wasn't born here. Yeah.
Yeah. Ricky Henderson?
Number 1. That's the tough one. Ricky Henderson.
Number 1. Yes, nice job.
111 WAR. He's a number 1 player, born in Illinois in history, by the way, not just, in the last 35 years.
Yeah. Ooh.
The top 3 are all Hall of Famers, by the way.
Oh, boy. Let me tell you, I am going to get in some trouble for not having named this right away. My father is from Peoria.
There you go.
And his younger brother, Darren, played on the same American Legion team as Jim Thome.
Yes.
Jim Thome, number 3.
Number 3.
Yeah. Really, really hope my dad doesn't listen to the end of this particular episode. All right.
I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tell you 4, 5, and 6, and 7 just for fun.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to use that time to figure out number 2. Go ahead.
Number 4 is Rick Russell. Big Daddy.
He didn't play
From
in the
Quincy.
Yes.
No, he did. Well, he did play in the 90s. Thank you very much.
My goodness. Yes, he did. That's
did.
true. But it is a preposterous fact about him.
Yes. And the fact that his WAR is higher than like most Hall of Famers is a whole nother story. But so you got him, Brett Saberhagen, the great Kansas City Royal pitcher, pitched into 2001. He's on the list. Here's one for you: Hall of Famer Kirby Puckett.
Yep.
From Chicago, a guy who played up until 1990, so he counts, is none other than Fred Lynn, the famous Boston Red Sox California Angel. And then rounding out the top 8 is none other than Chicago's very own favorite Detroit Tiger, Curtis Granderson.
Okay. So Granderson crossed my mind.
Yeah, decent list of guys, right?
Now that I have him kind of framed up, is it just Ben Zobrist?
He's 9th.
Okay.
So,
all right. Man, this is gonna kill me. I'm gonna be so upset.
What's gonna kill you the most is, well, I don't know if I should give it away. This is a guy who played for a team that you, I think, have followed off and on. Seriously, followed. One of your many, but still one of the teams you followed.
Yeah.
Hall of Famer, first ballot.
First ballot Hall. Well, okay. So now you're really rubbing it in.
Probably this team's greatest player. I mean, if you were to say what name, what picture would you have for this team?
Robin Yount from Illinois.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
There we go. Yep. I had an inkling, but I can't. Unlike, Ben Zobrist, Jim Thome,
Right.
Rick Russell, they're if there aren't statues of these guys in their hometowns, there need to be just gigantic ones. We know exactly where they're from, and I can, I can't tell you even what part of the state Robin Yount is from.
Illinois' favorite son from Danville, Illinois. He played his entire major league career within less than 100 miles of the Illinois state border.
Yeah. Well, not road games, Pat.
Well, not road games. Home games. Played a lot of his road games within the state of Illinois.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are Illinois' finest. The number 10, just to round it out, was Gary Gaetti, just for fun. Those are the top 10 of the 1990 through present day.
Ron Krumer just off the list, I guess, huh?
Just
barely.
Yeah. Just missed. So not a bad list, I think. Right?
No, pretty fun and a fun way to end the show. As haven't got to talk to you guys in a collective since October. Got the group back together here in December, and had a lot to talk about. And this was a great time. Matt, please remind our listeners where they can find all of your work on the internet.
Yeah. Northside Baseball, man. We are growing. We're doing, I think, really good work, and I hope you'll come check it out. Northsidebaseball.com. You can find pretty much anything I write, because I write there, but also Twins Daily, Brewer Fanatic, and Baseball Prospectus. And I'll post any of that on at matrueblood.bluesky.social or whatever, you know how to find people on Blue Sky by now, or at matrueblood on Twitter, but less and less there, more and more on Blue Sky.
Same for us. You can find us on all the platforms that serve you social media, including Blue Sky, of course, over at Wrigleyville Nat. That's where you can find us. That's also Instagram and X as well. And then make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, where you can get the video version of this podcast, even if you only consume your podcast via the audio medium. please go give us a subscribe over at the YouTube channel. Just search for
Follow
Wrigleyville
us
Nation
because you
Podcast.
can't watch the White Sox on YouTube, so you need some baseball.
If you search for Wrigleyville Nation Podcast over there, give us the subscribe. It helps us work the algorithm so other Cub fans can find the show. And of course, we could not bring you this show ad-free for another season if it wasn't for all of our generous patrons over at our Patreon, patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. The support that we have from all our patrons there helps keep this show ad-free as we go into yet another season. Can you believe the first time we did one of these shows was November of 2013? And here we are, December of 2024, starting another year of the podcast. So with that, we want to thank all of our listeners for their support. Thanks again, everyone, for listening. Pat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And we'll talk to you again next time.